Okay. So actually, what I'm going to do before I launch into the presentation is to give you a little bit of background about myself, because I know many of you know me at least a little bit, but just to give a little bit of more background about how I got into this field before I launch into this topic, which is really kind of offering an organizing frame for supporting relationships. Um, so I practiced pediatrics. I've always been interested in children's emotional health, and I was going to be a child psychiatrist, but then I realized that as a pediatrician, I would be kind of on the front lines in a great spot for prevention. And I got very good training. I actually even did a fellowship in developmental and behavioral pediatrics, but I didn't really feel that I had the tools to help people. And often even though I had I was working actually here in the Berkshires in a very busy practice. I would go to delivery rooms in the middle of the night, but I didn't really feel that I had the tools to help people. And then this very fortuitous thing happened where the Berkshire Psychoanalytic Institute opened actually in affiliation with Austin Riggs, which is about 20 minutes from my house. And I started studying and I started learning about some of the ideas which you'll hear about in this course, particularly Winnicott and Fonagy and then Arietta Slade. And that in turn led me to learn about this field of infant mental health, which I had never heard of. And then it was suggested to me that I do this training program.
I can bring it. Oh.
Where Ed Tronick is the senior faculty. And so I did, and I was a fellow. And then several years later, I was asked to join the faculty. And so I've worked very closely with him. And in the program, which if anyone's interested, I highly recommend it, we learn from luminaries from all over the world who come. It's a group of about 30 fellows who are also from all over the world. And we have these very intensive weekends where we learn with these leaders in the field. And it's really a transformative experience. So that's a little bit about how I came to be doing this work. And so really what this is all about is promoting healthy relationships. And as I showed you in that earlier PowerPoint, there's really of many interlocking core concepts. It's very hard to separate these out. And that's why I like it's rather than having them in a list, to have them in this lovely flower. And I really think the thing that ties everything together, which is what I'm talking about today, is this repair theory of development. But it's integrated with the neurobiology of safety, the concept of reflective functioning, which I'll talk about tomorrow morning, biological differences, which Melanie is going to elaborate on tomorrow afternoon. And then we're going to talk about in some detail about how relationships change the brain. And then tomorrow I'm going to delve into this concept of regulate, relate, reason.
Claudia, can you go to screen? Can you go to your screen view or slideshow view? We'll see those things much better. It's just not big enough. There we go. That looks better. Thanks. Sorry for interrupting.
No problem. Okay, so I mentioned before everybody got on that I gave some variation of this presentation. This is my fourth time in the past 3 weeks. And what's interesting is that they were very different audiences. I spoke with my colleagues at First Steps Together, which was a bunch of therapists, supervisors, and peer recovery coaches. Then I spoke at a conference on education, and then I spoke on a conference on attachment. And I think what that says really is that this theory of development that I'm going to present to you offers an organizing frame for anyone who interfaces with young children and families from whatever perspective. So in that sense, I think it's really a core of infant mental health. So a theory of development is something that tells us, these are my kids, and you see this to me, this is my son at about 4 months. This is like the classic what's going on face. Like no clue. How does the world work? as we've talked about it, and we saw in that video of the 3-day-old, babies come into the world with tremendous capacity for connection and communication, but they don't know anything about how they work, how relationships work. And then somehow this happens. So here, she obviously, my daughter who's about 4, she knows the idea of smiling at the camera. And then somehow here by he's about 18, he's figured that out too, and in relationship with her. So if we can have some very core understanding about how this happens, it really informs prevention, earlier intervention, and treatment in a wide variety of settings. So what is the repair theory of development? We were talking before everybody got on about having too many words on a slide. So I just could not let go of any of these words. So I made it as small as possible. It's an enormous concept. So I tried to make it into 4 succinct points, which I will read to you because I think these really help us to organize our thinking. So the first is that healthy relationships are characterized not by perfect attunement, but by a messy process of mismatch and repair. And this is a continuous process. And it is through this continuous moment by moment process that we build resilience and trust. And then this is what the Michael Jr. video showed us, that the capacity for both self-regulation and intimacy grow from moment to moment interactions in our earliest relationships, and that these experiences change our brain and body, organizing the way we function in new relationships throughout our lives. So that's kind of the essence of the repair theory of development. And it has some very significant treatment implications, which is that early interactions lacking in robust repair may lead to emotional suffering and derail development. So that's a very comprehensive view of emotional suffering. And the other major implication is that new sets of relationships with different qualities of interactions can promote healing and growth throughout the lifespan. And I'm going to talk more about epigenetics in the section on how relationships change the brain, but I just like to put this up front, which is that babies come into the world with biological vulnerabilities that may be carried in their genes from past generation. But their unique developmental path, whatever their genes, is guided by the moment-to-moment engagement with people who care for them. And this microscopic interactive process is the way they make sense of themselves and the world around them. Okay, so what is the evidence for this theory? So it's really in 2 pieces. One is the still face paradigm, and then what we are calling the 70-30 research. But I'm going to start by talking to you about the still face paradigm and the still face experiment. So this experiment is rooted in Dr. Tronick's experience going on rounds with Barry Brazelton. So Barry would take time with babies and he would draw out these qualities in them that were absolutely extraordinary. And it was back in the 60s, and actually generally parents were not with their babies in the nursery. So he was just looking at the baby and not the relationship. But, and Ed was kind of tagging along after him and was just blown away that this was not what he thought babies were, and the general kind of understanding of babies in the child development world was not that they are these incredibly connected, capable creatures. And it was really thought that in a parent-child relationship, it's the parent who runs the show. But what Ed saw when he went on rounds with Dr. Brazelton was that was not the case at all, and that the baby, right from the moment they're born, is an active participant. But so he was an experimental psychologist. That was his training. So he wanted to set up an experiment, essentially to test this hypothesis that the baby is actually an active participant in the relationship. And that is what the still face experiment is. And so I'm actually just going to show you there are many versions of this, but this is the one it's on YouTube. It's been viewed 10 million times. And it's scaffolded by Dr. Tronick himself, which is why I like it. He kind of offers a little bit of an explanation around the video. But then we're going to take some time, more time than I gave you last time I showed a video, to really talk about what this means. So let me just show you the video.
Babies this young are extremely responsive to the emotions and the reactivity and the social interaction that they get from the world around them. This is something that we started studying 30, 40 years ago, when people didn't think that infants could engage in social interaction. In the still face experiment, what the mother did was she sits down and she's playing with her baby, who's about a year of age.
I'm my good girl. Oh.
And she gives a greeting to the baby gives a greeting back to her.
Yeah.
This baby starts pointing at different places in the world, and the mother's trying to engage her and play with her. They're working to coordinate their emotions and their intentions, what they want to do in the world. And that's really what the baby is used to. And then we ask the mother to not respond to the baby. The baby very quickly picks up on this. And then she uses all of her abilities to try and get the mother back. She smiles at the mother. She points because she's used to the mother looking where she points. The baby puts both hands up in front of her and says, "What's happening here?" She makes that screechy sound at the mother, like, "Come on, why aren't we doing this?" Even in this 2 minutes, when they don't get the normal reaction, they react with negative emotions, they turn away, they feel the stress of it. They actually may lose control of their posture because of the stress that they're experiencing.
Okay. I'm here. And what are you doing? Oh, yes. Oh, what a big girl.
It's a little like the good, the bad, and the ugly. The good is that normal stuff that goes on, that we all do with our kids. The bad is when something bad happens, but the infant can overcome it. After all, when you stop the still face, the mother and the baby start to play again. The ugly is when you don't give the child any chance to get back to the good. There's no reparation, and they're stuck in that really ugly situation.
Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing. I know that this, some of you may have seen this before. I know some of you have. Some of you have seen it many times. But it always brings up a lot of feelings for people, which is why I really wanted to take some time for us to process that. So first, we're going to have you in groups. Are we doing, anyway, we're doing groups. I'm not sure if we're doing the same groups or different groups, but
it might be different.
Different groups. Okay, so we all get to know each other a little bit, and that'll be about 4 minutes or so. So you can talk amongst yourselves, and then we'll come back, and then we'll ask people to share, and we'll spend a little bit of time talking about people's reactions. Yay! You've sort of done my work for me. But because I think that you all recognize that this usually, like Susan said, the first reaction is that this is terrible. And I remember that when I first learned about the still face paradigm, I was studying with the Berkshire Psychoanalytic Institute. So I was a pediatrician, and I read about it. And I said, how did they get this past the IRB? It seemed cruel to me. And I guess that's for doing experiments, you have to get approval through the, I can't remember what IRB stands for, but that it's ethically sound to do the research. So I thought this was just terrible. That was my reaction. And similar, I've had the similar developmental process to Susan to really come to understand that this is what babies experience. And I think it is really but all of us, whether with our own children or as children with our parents, having experienced variations of this, um, probably at first resonate with the loss. But really, as you all so well pointed out so nicely, is that the baby has tremendous sense of agency. Like, this doesn't throw her at all. I mean, eventually she starts to unravel, but she just jumps right in, like she has seen this many, many, many times before. It's just magnified in the experiment. And she knows what to do. And so it really, so, just to slow it down a little bit, you see them there together. Then you see right away, oh, I'm going to clap my hands, because we've done this hand clapping game before, hundreds of thousands of times. So even though the baby has no, the baby may have some beginning words at a year, but with concepts and ideas, that the thinking parts of the brain are really just very primitive at that point. So somehow it's a bodily knowledge that I can bring my hands together to engage you. And Ed has a wonderful video where he actually did some experiments with a colleague in Italy where they had parents do a game that they typically do with their baby and then do the still face. And there's this beautiful video of this little baby, and you can see the incredible effort. This baby is younger, actually, about 8 months old. How the baby, with tremendous concentration, brings one hand up to meet the other. So it doesn't have the words, but kind of the music of the relationship is already in the baby's body. And then as time goes on, the baby starts to fall apart. But as you so wisely pointed out, it takes just barely, it's a millisecond or so for her to, be right back together with her mother. Okay, so I'm going to go on to the next level of evidence. I'm just going to see, are there any?
Claudia,
Yes,
may I
please.
ask a question?
Yes, please.
About what you just said.
Yeah.
The fact that the baby repaired,
Yeah.
the relationship kind of between mom and baby repaired so quickly as soon as mom started interacting and responding to the baby. Why is it so quick? Is it because they had beautiful relationship before, or children tend to respond so quickly positively?
I think, we don't know exactly, but I think it reflects, the behavior shows that the baby has the capacity to reorganize very quickly. So like thinking about the baby from the newborn who needs a lot of scaffolding to organize themselves. But this baby has had the experience of having her mother not look at her or be distracted or somehow not be available and then come back. So she very quickly knows what to do in her body to reorganize herself to be in relation with her mother. So I think that's the idea. Does that make sense? I wanted to just,
thank you so much.
Sure, something about people asking questions. For some reason, the way I have it with this up, I cannot see the chat. But I'm hoping
keeping an eye on it.
Yes, Linda. So if you either, just speak out or raise your virtual hand or put something in the chat, and Linda is looking out. So I'm going to keep talking, but I love when people interrupt me and ask questions. So please feel free to do that. And what I was going to say is I was going to do that anyway. So I appreciate that. Before I go on to the sort of next segment. Oh, Sarah, yes.
Sorry. So I just wanted to say we did actually talk about that in our group, the last question. And I had said that oftentimes what I had seen with some of the families that I worked with, when children did not have that type of bond that this child seemingly had with this mother, you know, because of what you saw at the beginning of the taping, there aren't so many tools in the toolbox usually that they come with to that parent to get their attention back, because they're not used to that full attention. And so there, I think there is definitely, from what I've seen and observed myself, a relationship to that,
Yeah,
where that bond, if that bond is not as strong as what it seemed in this video, you would not have seen the child try that many things to get the attention back, and they
that's,
wouldn't have gotten as upset, right?
well,
That's,
that's, yeah.
yeah.
That's exactly right. And actually, there is a lot of research on that, which I'm going to talk about a little bit with, as an example, with moms who have depression, and that you see a very different kind of reaction in the baby in the still face experiment. So yes, and I thank you for showing how that you really see that in the clinical world, in addition to the research world. So this is what happened. So he did this still face experiment. It kind of turned the field of child development upside down, because it was so different from the way people had thought about babies. But then what he did was, he wanted to really analyze in more fine detail some of these questions that this brought up. So he began to videotape typical parent-infant interactions. And then he slowed the videotape down into these frame-by-frame analyses to really understand the moment-to-moment interactions that you couldn't appreciate just watching it in real time. So he expected that they would be in this kind of attunement, this perfect attunement, which is this sort of expectation in you know, in our culture in general, and certainly in the child development world, that they would be in sync with each other. But then that's not what they found. And at first they were like, they kept throwing out the data because they thought it was a mistake. But then it became clear that this was the way relationships were, that 70% of interactions were out of sync. And this is a graphic from the facilitated attuned interactions training that I borrowed. Some of you may be familiar with, because I've talked to many people in many fields who refer to this 70-30 number. Often don't really know where it came from, but that's where it comes from. And this finding has been replicated for decades in a wide variety of settings. So what is the significance of this? You know, they expected to see this attunement and this mismatch, and they thought it was a problem, but it was actually the norm. And what was what differentiated robust development from problematic development was the robustness or paucity of repair. And you know, I just a lot of the ways people talk about relationships now, I was just at this attachment conference, and except for my little island of my talk that was in the middle of the whole conference, everything else is about attunement. And we hear serve and return. We hear this is very current, the way people think of a talk about relationships in this kind of Fred Astaire, Ginger Rogers magical way. But any of us who are in relationships, which is all of us, know from experience that they're really not like that. And relationships are messy. And so this research with the babies just offers evidence that not only our adult relationships are messy, but relationships between parents and babies are messy. And so why is that important? Why does that happen? And this is really
and then coming back up to Vermont
tonight. The idea is that healthy development is founded in the repair of the mismatch. And that's because it's, and all of us again know this experientially, but that the repair itself leads to the sense of pleasure in the relationship. Like it's messy and uncomfortable and people feel bad, and then they get through a difficult moment, and that leads to trust. Like, you will be with me at my worst and we will somehow connect with each other. And that leads to this kind of internal sense in the baby that I can overcome problems. And it teaches this kind of life lesson that you don't have to get stuck in a negative feeling state. And so when this happens over and over and over again, this is where I talked about the continuous meaning making. It's not a categorical kind of thing in relationships, but it's a continuous process that builds this core sense of agency and hope. So this is really saying the same thing again in a just slightly different way, which is that the repair actually provides the fuel for growth and change. So relationships that are just smooth and nothing ever goes wrong, which there aren't such relationships, but they would tend to stagnate and sort of inhibit growth. Whereas, as Sarah talked about, when there's this opportunity for repair, a person develops coping strategies and it's a core sense of hopefulness that I can get through a tough moment, or agency. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about resilience, but that's really where the capacity for trust comes from, is when you go from misunderstanding to understanding, from misconnection to connection. So I'm mindful of so many words on my slide. So I'm just going to use this concept of meaning making. So as a baby goes through this repair with a caregiver, they make meaning of themselves in the world. They make meaning of themselves as someone who has agency, someone who can make their world better. And that meaning is not in words, it's in their body, like in that hand clapping. So this is got what we were talking about earlier, but there is certainly a huge body of evidence that when a caregiver is not available for a whole host of reasons to engage in that robust repair, that the baby reacts very differently in the still face experiment. So this was, there's research where they screened moms and found moms with a diagnosis of depression, and then they did the still face experiment, and the babies would more likely to turn inward. They might suck on their hand or look at a light on the ceiling. They found other strategies for holding themselves together, but they didn't like convey this sense of hope that they would be able to get their mother back. And then they did these studies where they did the videotaped analysis, and they found that the time, not only were there more mismatches, but the actual time to repair was longer. And this was related to the levels of the stress hormone cortisol, which is a good thing in small doses, but when cortisol, when the body is continually bathed in cortisol with prolonged mismatch, that is not good for the growth of the brain and all the organs of the body. And then equally important, it's not just about the effects of the cortisol on the brain, but this way of being in relation to other people is carried forward into other relationships. And there's some fascinating research that he did where the researchers who then interacted with these babies found themselves feeling inadequate and somehow that they couldn't engage the baby. They felt, but it was actually the baby who was bringing this way of being from their interaction with the mother. But the researcher thought it was them. It's kind of like early, sort of from the psychoanalytic language, it's kind of projective identification. They were sort of taking on the experience of somebody in interaction with a baby of a depressed mom.
Claudia,
Yeah.
I've actually seen it where it looks as if the baby's doing the still face.
Yeah.
Like there's no, even in the interaction, the positive one where they're playing with the baby will not engage. And I think that's what you're referring to when because they've not had that experience. They don't have that repertoire of engagement strategies, even when they're asked to engage, much less when they're asked to disengage.
Yes, exactly. And that's why I don't show those videos. They're really, really hard to watch. So, we can think of lots of ways in the families we interact with that a baby might not have had this robust experience with repair. So, for example, parents who are preoccupied with their own troubled relationship, or there might be a paucity of repair with an anxious mother who intrusively anticipates her baby's every need, or simply, and certainly in the time of COVID, when parents are just overwhelmed and chronically exhausted and they just can't do it. Then, of course, then there's a situation of substance use where parents are intermittently emotionally available, but also, and this is something that Melanie's going to go into in much more detail tomorrow, to think about, is that there are infants who are difficult to connect with, and infants whose signals are difficult to read, infants who have a high sensitivity to sensory inputs, infants with difficulty with state regulation. So there are lots of ways in which there can be an atypical experience of repair. So this is kind of beyond this talk a little bit, but this is what I talked about when I presented to the educators. And this term adverse childhood experiences, which has also kind of infiltrated our language, can really be understood as a loss of interactive coping. So going back to Michael Jr., who was really fully present there. Although what I find so interesting about that video is that he took the video and he didn't even remember it until he watched it. He was actually there. So he was so fully present to be connected with his daughter. And so imagine, in a situation where a parent is not able to do that, and that sort of takes you inside the baby's experience. And that's really, we can really understand adversity as anything that depletes the caregiver's resources and prevents them from being present to regulate their own and their infant psychological state. So this is really the mechanism by which adverse childhood experiences get into our brain and body when moment-to-moment interactions are distorted over time. So trauma is kind of a distorted meaning making, and I'm going to talk about tomorrow. I'm going to talk about Bruce Perry's work and how when people are stressed, even though they may have made new meanings in their lives, the early meanings that are embedded in their body can kind of override conscious meanings in situations of stress. Okay, so if it's a kind of a way to reconsider the terms trauma and resilience, because the word trauma suggests, even though that's not usually what we mean when we talk about trauma, in fact, it's a word that's used so often that exactly what it means is very unclear. But it's sometimes used to describe like one thing that happened, like your house getting washed away in a landslide, or death of a parent when you're young, or but usually we use it to describe something that happens over and over and over again in your daily life. And a colleague of mine whose mother was severely depressed and eventually committed suicide, she said, I would never have thought about my life as trauma. That was just kind of the way life was. And that those countless moment-to-moment interactions are kind of like raindrops that shape the landscape of our sense of self. And something becomes traumatic when we get stuck in patterns of disconnection and miscommunication. And it also leads us to reconsider this idea of resilience, where certainly there's some genetic component to resilience, but it's when you survive these moment-to-moment mismatches that resilience, this is a phrase from our book, resilience is woven into the fabric of your being in hundreds of thousands of moments over time. I have only one slide here about historical trauma, but this is a huge subject, and I'm actually going to talk more about it when we talk about how relationships change the brain. And I'm going to skip this slide. And I'm actually going to stop here just to see you all. And I'm curious how people hear this kind of redefining of trauma-informed care, what you think of it, and this notion that relationships are messy. Any questions, things that come up for you from your clinical work or otherwise? Is this surprising? No. About it. And that's why this idea that we need to make new meanings in countless interactions in a whole bunch of relationships. So it's not like a one-time solution. And so it really calls for a kind of a different model of mental health from the medical model of disease by showing us how emotional well-being and emotional distress both grow out of variations in repeated moment-to-moment exchanges that make each of us who we are. And like I've said repeatedly, it's not fixed. And the very act of naming something kind of fixes it in time. But for children especially, emotional well-being evolves in a continuous developmental process in relationships. So when early interactions were lacking in robust repair, it can create meanings of hopelessness that lead to emotional suffering and derailed development. But we can change, and that's really the key message of all of this, is that these relationships are not baked in the cake. But again, I've said this now several times, but I think this is something we often miss, is that it's really the relational milieu that all sorts of ways people are in relationship with each other that can help move from emotional suffering to emotional health. So this is how I see whatever setting you're working in, that the core task, I think we've talked a lot about, social justice. And certainly, though, there are things we can do that are more political, more policy oriented. But in our one-on-one interaction with another human being, if we focus on our core task as making meaning of ourselves in relationship with another that is characterized by a sense of hope and belonging. So now I'm just going to show you a little example of this using the NBO. So this is a case where we trained the nurses at Fairview Hospital to do the NBO, and then they were doing a brochure, and we got consent from the family before the baby was born. The mom was going to have a C-section the next day. And they were terrified because their older son had made it very clear that he did not want this baby brother in their lives. And they were really terrified about how he was going to react. So you can see this play out in this moment of meeting. So here he is, clearly, there's the baby. He is very unhappy about this. And dad looks a little bit frozen, and mom is trying her best. And then this wonderful nurse, Deanne, comes in, and she's starting to do the orienting items with the baby. And it doesn't matter exactly what you do. The idea is that you're creating this kind of play space to see what the baby is all about. And you see that the brother is just, tentatively beginning to open up. And there he is. And you see that you can't see the father's face that well, but he definitely has gone from that terrified, frozen look. And the parents actually said it was the first time they felt that they could see a way forward. Just thinking about how I want to manage this. I have a couple of cases. Maybe if I just tell you about this one case, and because I have in the last half hour, I want to talk about the neurobiology of safety. But I just want to give you another example of what I mean by these moments of meeting. So this was a mom. Every time I tell a clinical story, the details are changed, but so she was on Suboxone, and I saw her by Zoom with her 3-week-old daughter. And she described to me right off the bat that the baby was tight because of having experienced withdrawal. Although the baby had actually not been required any medication and had just a typical stay, but this was the meaning mom had made of the baby's behavior. So it's quite possible that could be true, but I didn't know. So I said, well, let's watch the baby. And I had her put the baby down on the floor and move the camera over there to where I could see the baby. And we saw immediately the baby extended her extremities. And then I asked mom to talk to the baby, and she turned her to her mom's voice. And then just like you saw in that brief NBO clip that I showed you, the baby really moved her arms in a purposeful way towards mom. And then she started to fuss a little bit, and her mom picked her up and she folded into herself. And mom said, you know, it's not that she's tight, it's that she's really good at comforting herself. So just this little moment of observation allowed her to really change the meaning that she made of the baby's behavior. And then just like I said in that NBO clip, she said to me, she's such a little person already. So that's just, I'm going to stop sharing. I'd just like to give a little clinical vignette to make it more real. And I'm going to, open it up to questions about what I've said so far before I go on to a little bit of a discussion about the neurobiology of safety. A bit about safety. Okay, because I'm going to talk about the flower again. It's very hard to say what comes first when I'm describing these different interrelated ideas. And I think Linda, when you talk about the clinical skills and being reflective, probably the very first thing that has to happen is for the people involved in the interaction to feel safe. And when people have had long histories of unrepaired mismatch, things do not feel safe. And so I'm going to just talk about the autonomic nervous system a little bit. So the autonomic nervous system is really the frontline meaning making system. It's how our bodies assess whether a situation is safe or not. And this slide is a little bit out of order. So what happens is if we don't feel safe, we can't engage socially. So really the very first thing in any setting is, as Steve Porges, who developed the polyvagal theory of emotional development, which is way more complicated than I can contain in this talk, but we can talk about it more if anybody's interested. But he says the feeling of safety is the treatment. So just to give you, this is a very broad overview of the autonomic nervous system, which consists of 3 different ways that we can assess a sense of safety. So when we're calm, the parasympathetic nervous system is engaged, and we can look into another person's eyes. We have like an easy rhythm to our voice, and we are open for social engagement. But when there's an experience of fear, the sympathetic nervous system kicks in, and you have what is very well known as the fight-flight response. But far more often, probably, than the fight-flight response, certainly for adults, is that there's a sense of overwhelming threat, and what happens is dissociation. And there are many situations where, I think this is actually where the slide was out of order, where the fight-flight response is not an option, particularly if you're a parent and your child's behavior is somehow triggering to you. With hope, you're not going to hurt the child, and you're not going to abandon the child. So what you do, and this is not in your conscious mind, is that you freeze. And that's really what this is where this is connected to the still face paradigm, where when a parent makes meaning of a situation as threatening, they may actually show a still face to a child. Okay, that's what I was just saying. And similarly, in therapy, when a parent brings a child for assessment, it's an extremely threatening experience, that there's something wrong with your child. So already, I could sort of imagine that this mom is in the dissociated state. You know, she looks like she's trying to listen, but probably when you're in that kind of under the influence of what Steve Porges called the primitive vagus, you literally the muscles of the middle ear don't work properly. You know, so it's like you really can't take in information. So Steve Porges describes this concept of neuroception, which is the way our autonomic nervous system makes meaning of a situation as safe. So very young infants can detect a sense of threat on the face. And Ed has some wonderful videos of a baby pulling on his mother's hair, which is something that babies do. And it's this frame by frame analysis, she actually makes this sort of bare tooth grin like she's going to growl at him. I mean, she's totally unconscious, but if someone pulls your hair, that's just what your face does. And you see the baby, even though the baby doesn't have words for that, the baby responds that's threatening. But then you see that the mom realizes what she's done, and then they have this beautiful moment of repair. And so we really need that social connection to protect against the harmful effects of stress. And this neuroception, Porges describes it as our own personal TSA agent. So in any situation here, I've talked about, we want to facilitate moments of meeting, but in order to do that, we have to feel safe. And so this is very concrete, like the time you are with another person, like setting aside a chunk of time to talk with someone rather than talking to them in a hurry. Or I have this other case with one of my colleagues who had a client who was in a very, very bad way, but she texted her repeatedly over the course of the day. And that kind of rhythm of the mismatch repair of being present, that in and of itself was what created the sense of safety, the literal moment to moment availability of the text. And then in the clinical world, the physical space in which we are is critical to creating that sense of safety, and the way we use our voice, prosody, my favorite word, one of my favorite words. And I'm going to talk a lot more about this tomorrow, actually, in describing a case and how to use this idea of creating the sense of safety in the clinical setting. So I'm just going to read you this. This is from The Power of Discord. And, you know, I was saying that I struggle with what order to put these things in, because when I first started learning about a different way to understand the work I was doing with families, the very first thing that I learned about is the thing I'm going to talk about tomorrow morning, which is the concept of parental reflective functioning. And that if I was to give parents a safe space to be curious, this is another thing that Linda talked about, that they could be reflective about their child, and that would be the thing that would promote healing. But I came to understand that it was actually the repair that was the mechanism for change. So I'll just read this little bit to you from our book, The Power of Discord. As the field of pediatrics exploded with diagnoses of ADHD and the newly discovered pediatric bipolar disorder, I experimented with creating a space for families to move from disconnection to reconnection. In part, this change was concrete. I started reserving 50 minutes for an appointment rather than the standard 30, and saw families in a larger, more comfortable office. I recognized that the amount of time for the visit and the safety of the physical space played a critical role. As I shifted from asking questions and giving advice to simply listening, frequently sitting on the floor with younger children, I saw families move from anger and disconnection, sometimes through deep sadness, and then to moments of reconnection. A young child would spontaneously run into their mother's arm to receive a hug. Often I felt a tingling in my arms and my eyes filled with tears in the presence of rediscovered joy and love. So I think, you know, we've alluded to this. Safety is just hard to come by in the time of COVID. And we first started teaching this course, you know, I think people were really terrified in March of last year. I think people have equilibrated a bit, although it's still not safe. And so more than ever, we need to have these messy moments in interaction with each other, where people are on top of each other. All of you in Bermuda stuck at home have countless opportunities for moment to moment messy interactions, more than you probably ever wanted. But that's where the sense of safety comes, by having these difficult moments and really just making sure you navigate to find your way to repair. So that's the frame, and we're going to go on to reflective functioning and regulate, relate, reason tomorrow morning. But now we have a full 15 minutes for discussion.